newsreel cameras are rolling. A radio announcer is mid-sentence, describing a routine, almost boring landing. Then flames erupt near the tail of the largest flying object human beings had ever built. In 34 seconds, an 804-foot airship carrying 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen gas collapses into a burning skeleton on the ground below. On May 6, 1937, the German airship Hindenburg caught fire while attempting to dock at Naval Air Station Lakehurst in New Jersey. 36 people died, 13 passengers, 22 crew members, and 1 member of the ground crew. 62 people, remarkably, survived. Nearly 90 years later, investigators still cannot say with certainty what specific spark ignited the gas that destroyed the Hindenburg. But they can say, with total certainty, why that spark was capable of destroying an entire airship in half a minute. And that answer traces back not to one mistake made that evening, but to a decision made years earlier, thousands of miles away, about which gas to put inside it in the first place. To understand why the Hindenburg burned so completely, so fast, you have to understand a choice that had nothing to do with the crew flying it that day. Rigid airships like the Hindenburg stayed aloft using large internal gas cells, and by 1937, there were exactly 2 gases anyone used to fill them: helium, which does not burn, and hydrogen, which is extraordinarily flammable. Every airship operator, including the Zeppelin company that built and flew the Hindenburg, wanted helium. It was inert, safe, and eliminated the single greatest risk of lighter-than-air travel. But helium in the 1930s was, for practical purposes, a resource controlled almost entirely by one country, the United States. The Hindenburg's designers had, in fact, originally intended for the ship to use helium. But in 1927, the United States passed the Helium Control Act, restricting export of the gas. And by the mid-1930s, with Nazi Germany's military buildup underway and international tensions rising, the US government was unwilling to sell helium to the German government, which by then controlled the Zeppelin company. The Hindenburg was left with no legal path to the safer gas its own engineers had designed it around. So it flew, as every hydrogen airship before it had flown for decades, filled with roughly 7 million cubic feet of a gas that ignites easily and burns explosively fast. For years, this had not been a fatal flaw. Commercial Zeppelins had carried tens of thousands of passengers across more than 2,000 flights and over 1 million miles without a single passenger injury. The Hindenburg itself had already completed a full season of successful transatlantic crossings the year before. On its first scheduled flight of the 1937 season, the Hindenburg departed Frankfurt on May 3rd, carrying 97 people, 36 passengers, and 61 crew, bound for Lakehurst, New Jersey. Strong headwinds slowed the crossing considerably. The airship's scheduled arrival, originally set for 6 in the morning on May 6th, was pushed back a full 12 hours to 6 that evening. By the time the Hindenburg finally approached Lakehurst, the ship's ground crew, the weather, and the clock had all conspired to compress what should have been a routine, unhurried landing into something considerably more rushed. Nobody aboard yet knew how much that would matter. At approximately 7 p.m. on May 6th, the Hindenburg began its final approach to the mooring mast at Lakehurst, more than 12 hours behind schedule, with thunderstorms having rolled through the area only shortly before. The commanding officer, Captain Max Pruss, made a decision that investigators would examine closely afterward. Rather than the wide, gradual approach typically used, he opted for a tighter, faster turn to bring the airship in more quickly, in part to make up lost time. This maneuver placed unusual aerodynamic stress on the tail section of the ship. Investigators later determined the crew had difficulty bringing the Hindenburg into proper trim during this final approach, struggling, in the language of the official inquiry, to balance the airship correctly as it slowed. Some experts have pointed to this difficulty as circumstantial evidence that hydrogen may already have been leaking from one of the rear gas cells before the ship ever reached the mooring mast. Though this was never conclusively proven, at 7:21 p.m., mooring lines were dropped from the front of the airship to the ground crew below. 6 minutes later, at approximately 7:25, a second set of lines was released from the ship's stern. Something inside that airship was already going wrong. Nobody on board could see it, and by the time anyone did, there would be less than a minute left to do anything about it. It was in these final minutes, with the ship nearly stationary and its crew members positioned throughout the vessel for docking, that witnesses on the ground first saw flickering light near the top of the tail section. Within seconds, flame engulfed the rear of the airship. The hydrogen inside ignited with tremendous speed, and the fire raced forward along the entire length of the ship. The Hindenburg's tail dropped to the ground first as its internal structure gave way, and the burning airship settled, nose still partially aloft, onto the landing field in a matter of seconds. The entire destruction of the ship, from the first visible flame to its collapse on the ground, took roughly 34 seconds. Passengers and crew leapt from windows and openings in the burning wreckage, some from a considerable height, in a desperate attempt to escape before the fire reached them. Of the 97 people aboard, 62 survived, a number many investigators and historians have called remarkable given the speed and intensity of the fire. 35 of those aboard died, along with one member of the ground crew struck by falling wreckage. What exactly ignited the leaking or venting hydrogen has never been established with absolute certainty. Both the American and German investigating commissions, working independently in the weeks that followed, converged on the same leading theory. An electrostatic discharge, a spark caused by a buildup of static electricity on the airship's outer skin, likely triggered as damp mooring lines effectively grounded the ship's frame, while its separate outer covering remained electrically charged, creating a sudden difference in electrical potential and ultimately a spark. Recent independent research conducted decades later has largely reinforced this same conclusion. The official story was never quite the whole story. Investigators closed their case. The question of what really happened never fully closed with it. Alternative theories, including the possibility of sabotage, were investigated at the time. The FBI itself opened an inquiry into that possibility, and have never been entirely ruled out by every historian who has examined the case, even as the overwhelming weight of technical evidence points toward an accidental static spark igniting leaked hydrogen gas. Both the United States Commerce Department and the German Investigating Commission concluded, independently, that the Hindenburg's destruction was caused by the ignition of free hydrogen gas that had accumulated in the upper rear portion of the ship, almost certainly from a leak in one of the rearmost gas cells. Neither investigation ever conclusively identified the specific leak's cause, nor proved beyond doubt exactly how the ignition source arose. What both did conclude, unambiguously, was the underlying vulnerability that turned a leak into a catastrophe. 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen gas, housed inside a passenger-carrying aircraft, because the safer alternative had been placed off limits by an international political decision that had nothing to do with airship engineering at all. Radio announcer Herbert Morrison's live, emotional description of the disaster, broadcast the following day, became one of the most famous pieces of recorded audio in American history, cementing the Hindenburg's destruction in public memory in a way few industrial accidents ever achieve. The disaster effectively ended the era of passenger airship travel almost overnight. Confidence in the safety of hydrogen-filled rigid airships, already fragile after a string of earlier military and civilian airship losses in the years before, could not survive images and film footage of the Hindenburg collapsing into flame in front of live newsreel cameras. Commercial Zeppelin service across the Atlantic, which had carried passengers safely for years, never resumed. The rise of long-range airplanes, already underway before the Hindenburg disaster, accelerated in its aftermath, effectively closing the brief chapter in aviation history when giant hydrogen airships had been, for a time, the fastest and most luxurious way to cross the ocean. Nearly 90 years later, the precise ignition source that destroyed the Hindenburg remains, technically, unresolved. A specific spark that history was never able to fully trace. What history can trace, with far greater certainty, is the decision that made that unknown spark so devastating in the first place. A safer gas, made unavailable by politics rather than physics, replaced by one that turned a routine, half-completed landing into 34 seconds that ended an entire mode of travel. Subscribe to Error Code Human, featuring new documentaries every week.